And we will get started now. And hello, everyone. Let me welcome all of you to our webinar on how to publish education research, and wish you all a happy Teachers' Day tomorrow, happy Teachers' Month, or simply a good day wherever you are. Teachers' Day in India is September 5th, the birthday of Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, and among other things, he said two quotes I'd like to share. Teachers should be the best minds in the country, and books are the means by which we build bridges between cultures. These ideas, valuing and optimizing the educational enterprise and sharing our work for mutual benefit, get to the heart of why we're here today and the spirit of education research. As we begin our introductions, I'd like to invite you to answer a few poll questions which should appear on your screen shortly about your own careers. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speakers to introduce themselves to you all, Dr. Karishma Kaushik and Dr. Stanley Maloy.
Welcome, everyone. Great to see you here. And thank you to ASM and JMBE for the opportunity. I'm Karishma Kaushik. I'm a physician scientist. My training has spanned India and the United States. And recently, well, it's been a few years, I returned to India to start my independent research group and then took on a leadership position in Indian science. Along the way, I've published a substantial part of my teaching and education-related research, and I look forward to sharing it with you all here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stanley Maloy. I'm a professor of biology at San Diego State University, and I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education. I really look forward to our conversation today.
And to introduce myself, I'm Mike Lerman. I came to ASM after graduating from Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania. I've been here for 21 years, and I'm currently the managing editor of ASM's review journals and also the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education, about which we're going to talk today. In fact, I've worked on many of ASM's journals over the years as a copy editor and production editor also, so I'd like to speak to you as a representative of ASM and the journals program generally. To introduce ASM has been in the vanguard of microbiology for more than 125 years, one of the largest life science professional societies globally, sponsoring global research symposia in China and India, as well as other meetings worldwide. Membership is also worldwide, with benefits like clinical and career resources, grant opportunities with membership levels for students and postdocs, plus the global outreach category, so I invite you to investigate whether you are eligible. And finally, ASM Journals publishes premier journals on all aspects of the microbial sciences, clinical, basic, applied, environmental, as well as microbiology education, which is reflected by JMBE. JMBE is ASM's open access microbiology education journal that publishes a variety of research and resources for teaching biology at all levels. We'll be talking more about JMBE throughout the webinar, and I'm pleased to pass the presentation over to that journal's editor-in-chief, Stanley Maloy.
Hi, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my education journey and why I think it's so critical to have effective and engaging STEM education. And in that process, I'm going to tell you about my revelation about why this is so important. And then we'll talk a little bit about discipline-based education research. Next slide, please. So I have a long journey through multiple universities. And I've taught a wide variety of courses at all of these different universities at different levels. I've also been really lucky to have been able to teach a number of advanced courses at places around the world. So I deeply believe in teaching and really understand how important it is for teaching to be effective and engaging. Next slide, please, Mike. A few of the critical roles that are absolutely why we need STEM education to be so effective is because we're not going to be able to recruit and train that next generation of microbiologists, people who are working in clinical labs or public health, the researchers making new discoveries, or even the innovative entrepreneurs that have microbiological applications if we don't entice them in the education process. In addition, we also need to ensure that everyone, non-science majors, everyone going through school understands core concepts of microbiology that impact their personal lives and our society. And finally, microbiology is so critical for solving so many complex global problems that we need more people engaging in these problems in an effective way. Next slide, please, Mike. To achieve those goals, we don't simply need to teach microbiology, but we need to teach it in a very effective and engaging way, right? Now, I've won several awards for teaching, and like most dedicated teachers, it was because I regularly adapted my approaches and I tweaked my content and I tried new things. Throughout my career, I've kept thinking about keeping the things that work and modifying or eliminating those that could be done better, right? But all of these changes early in my career were based upon anecdotal evidence. Next slide, please, Mike. And this is an example. This is the way I thought my students were learning in a lecture class, right? I typically taught a 90-minute class. This is from a class that we had a very large number of students. It was over 400 students. And I expected, some students aren't paying attention at the beginning, but most are. And over time, a few will get distracted, but still most of them will take home that content because it's so interesting and important in their lives. Next slide, please. But I did this was based on my opinion, right? How do you really know that your teaching approach is effective? Because I had won some teaching awards, I was expected by the university to attend all of the lectures on education from external speakers. And one day I went and heard a lecture by Charles Bonwell. Charles Bonwell was a pioneer in thinking about a concept called active learning. And he really had a big role in thinking about education research and improving education. He showed in his seminar actual data on retention versus lecture time. And it included statistical evidence that applied to a wide variety of audiences, whether we're talking about people who are 6 years old or where we're talking about people who are in the university. Next slide, please. And this is what his data showed. For virtually any of these audiences, you put a good teacher in front of them, you start with a high level of retention, and it drops very quickly. So in my 90-minute lecture, by the end of the lecture, students were retaining less than 25% of the things I was saying. Now, teaching is a lot of work. It's a lot of energy you put into it. And for students to be retaining 20% of what you say, it's just unacceptable. Next slide, please. But Bonwell showed that there was a solution, and that solution involved interrupting a lecture and making students, for 1 or 2 minutes, actively think about a problem that you give them. Not just do something routine, but actively think about a problem. And you can see that the kinetics of learning drops off, but as soon as you do this interruption for active learning, it falls with the same kinetics. So immediately, the mean amount of information that students retain from that lecture increases about twofold. That's pretty good. Next slide, please. But he also showed if you do this at different times during the lecture, it continues to raise. And every time it falls off with the same kinetics. So now you can increase the amount of learning your class is getting by 3-fold or 4-fold. It's a really important difference. What convinced me about this was that he showed the data, that he showed statistics, and he indicated that this applies to a wide variety of different situations by doing those experiments. Next slide, please. And about this same time, right, that he was doing these experiments, we were learning a lot from neuroscience about learning and memory and being able to apply those concepts into education. That information told us that learning is actually an active process. It's not simply passively listening to a lecture. The application requires both factual knowledge and the context of that knowledge. That learning is shaped by the experiences of the students, their culture, their community, all of their different experiences. We also learned that effective assessment requires more than just giving students a test that determines whether they memorized key facts. And that assessment really should be learner-centric. We learned that effective teaching emphasizes active learning and student-centered pedagogy. It builds on core competencies throughout the education process and continually improves by implementing evidence-based teaching. Next slide, please, Mike. So this really led to the whole field of discipline-based education research, or DBER for short. This is empirical research on learning outcomes from different approaches to education. And it requires this comparison with control groups as well as statistical validation. Some examples of effective approaches that we've learned over the last years: active learning is very effective. Course-based undergraduate research experiences, our cures, are really very important. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, and we actually already have a question about this in the Q&A. Flipped classes are another way of providing this information, where students read the content at home, and then they go to class and discuss and work on problem solving as a group. Each of these experiments, though, leads to a new question. So, for example, in the classroom, there was great evidence that active learning influenced the student participation and retention. But does active learning work in an online teaching environment? People needed to do a study to determine if that was true. You could also ask other questions like, can reading of primary scientific literature be an effective way of engaging students and getting them to think about problems instead of just previous facts? Next slide, please. But fundamentally, when you think about this discipline-based education research, it's really the scientific method in its purest form. Basically, you make a hypothesis, you have to plan your experiments. What do you want to do? Why, who, and how are you going to do it? And you need to think about statistical considerations. You need to get approvals if you're using humans for research, or if there are biosafety implications. From that, you design your experiment and acquire data and get results. And then you say, is this data statistically valid, right? Next slide, please, Mike. And based on those experiments, if it supports your hypothesis, it gives you the evidence that you should publish and share with other people so we can all learn from your experiences. Or alternatively, it negates your hypothesis, and it means that you need to revise and repeat your experiment to really address the question. Next slide, please. So why does this matter so much, right? This kind of research continually improves student learning success. It provides these evidence-based insights into effective teaching approaches. It builds on prior research that others have done, and it stimulates further research so that you get this continued improvement. It breaks down these barriers from people with different backgrounds and experiences. And it really opens opportunities to engage broader audiences in a meaningful way. So sharing your education research with others, doing the research and publishing the research, can catalyze meaningful educational changes that impact students' lives. It impacts all of our education practices, and it impacts the future of science. Next slide, please. So what are the requirements for publishing STEM education research? So it's just like publishing basic research. You need to clearly define the rationale and hypothesis for what you did. You need to describe how you experimentally tested that hypothesis, including controls. You need to show how you analyze the data, including statistics that demonstrate that your conclusions are valid. And you need to offer conclusions that are based on that evidence that you have. Next slide, please. But very, very important, to do this, you need to plan in advance. Before starting to do this kind of research, because education research involves people, you need to ask the question, do I need approval for research with students who may be considered human subjects? Do I need approval for biosafety issues if I'm doing laboratory experiments that may expose the students to potential harm? Determining if the results are meaningful also requires comparisons. What kind of data do you need? How big of a sample size do you need? How will you analyze your results? Well, you need help analyzing those results. Before you start your experiments, these are core questions that you need to answer to ensure that all of the work you go into research gives you a meaningful publication. Next slide, please. And when I say you may need help analyzing your results, part of this has to do with thinking about statistics. The assessment and analytics often require sophisticated statistical skills. And if you don't have those skills, you should find an expert to collaborate with you. For example, this is a paper published in the Journal of Microbiology Biology Education a couple of years ago. And in this paper, they had a lot of complicated data comparing different groups. And the statistics was just very complex. In talking with the statistician, they learned about this process called exploratory factor analysis that allowed them to take all of their experiments and put them into a meaningful context. Without that collaborator, this data would have been a mess, right? So think very hard about, do you need that statistical collaborator before you get started? Next slide. And now I'm turning this over to you, Karishma.
Thank you very much, Stan, for setting the stage for my section of the webinar. I hope everyone can hear me, see me. I hope you're all good. All right, I think we had some issues with the poll initially. So maybe, Mike, could we pull up the poll again, the first poll? Wonderful, thank you. I hope you can all see the poll. And if you can, please do answer it for us. We would like to know how you describe your primary role at work. There are some options there for you to get started. And have you published education research before? Fret not, even if you haven't, because that's the whole point of this webinar, to be able to give you some ideas, which Stan has set up really nicely. And now I'll talk about some case scenarios, some practical examples of how you can take your teaching, your laboratory courses, and turn that into an education publication. All right, so thank you, Mike. I think we got the poll going. So that little bit about me, as I said in the introduction, I'm a medical doctor. I trained in India and moved to the United States for my Ph.D. I wrapped up my Ph.D. at the University of Texas at Austin, and then returned to India to start my independent research group at a state university. So I have taught in medical college during my PhD in the US as a teaching assistant, and I'll talk a little bit about that subsequently. And then I returned to India to work in a state university that caters to large numbers of students from diverse backgrounds, several of them first-generation learners, first-generation college goers. We can move to the next slide, Mike. Thank you. All right, so like I mentioned, my first brush with teaching, serious brush with teaching, was during my stint as a teaching assistant at University of Texas at Austin. I did my PhD in a new biophysics laboratory, and I basically had to teach through my PhD. Sounds daunting, and it was, to teach for 5 years along with my research. But what it did is, because I was doing my PhD in a lab that was so far out of my comfort zone as a trained medical doctor, being a teaching assistant for courses like public health, infectious diseases, microbiology, bacterial pathogenesis allowed me to stay in touch with my area of expertise, with what I was comfortable with. What it also did give me a lot of teaching experience, towards the end of which I was able to adapt my teaching throughout the semester based on feedback received from the students. There was a lot of a lot of feedback on the course as well as on my teaching style, which I continuously could put into my teaching again. So it actually turned out to be a very wholesome and fulfilling professional experience, being a teaching assistant through my PhD. We can move on to the next slide. So after my PhD, I returned to India so after my PhD, I actually stayed on in the US for a few years in a non-tenure track teaching position. And here, instead of being a teaching assistant for a course, I was actually leading the course. It was a laboratory course for over 200 undergraduate students who were pre-medical, pre-dental, pre-pharmacy, and so on. And there were hands-on experiments as well as statistical analysis of data and other theoretical parts of the course. So during these 3 years that I taught this course independently, I really deep dived into seeking feedback from the students, both on my teaching style and on the course, and regularly put it back into my teaching. One of the things I learned beyond feedback was the ability to design surveys for seeking the right kind of feedback. And it was an early lesson that a poorly designed survey is, there's really nothing much you can do with it in terms of the information you wanted. So it taught me that if I ever have to publish a component of the course or publish any kind of instructional feedback I have, I'm going to have to design that survey well. That was an early lesson. The other thing I learned how to use research and inquiry, which I had already picked up during my PhD, into my teaching practice, like make the experiments clearer, better, using the right kinds of resources, conveying the right teaching objective or learning objective. And all of that was learned during these 3 years. Next slide, please, Mike. So after I wrapped up this stint, I received a Government of India fellowship and I returned to my home country, ready to start my research group. And as I said, I was a new faculty at a state university. And as all new faculties have to, one of my early tasks was to take on some administrative roles. It was actually a fun task given to me. I was put in charge for undergraduate student orientation in the first year that I joined the state university as faculty. So this was a course for integrated bachelor's and master's course for undergraduate students who had joined the university. A cohort of about 30 students joined every year. So it was a very small, well-curated, integrated program. And I was told to conduct a student orientation. I wanted to make it engaging, exciting, accessible, communicative. And so I came up with the science art module. As you can see on the image on the left, there are lots of students who are sitting on their knees, working with multiple art canvas. And so they were given some basic supplies like canvas and paints, and they were asked to build something together. So it was a group activity, and it really made them get onto their knees and sort of get into the trenches and work together during the course of the activity. And they could put anything on the canvas. The only instruction given to them was this is going to be put up in the university after it's done. And so this is what they came up with. Basically, they represented different forms of life, from mushrooms to fungi, animalia, mammals, trees, in different forms. During this exercise, it was 3 hours long. And while this was happening, I was taking notes. And at the end of it, I gave them a feedback, a sort of a survey that I had designed. Now I knew how to design because of my 3 years of independent teaching experience in the US. So we collected feedback. And this was really important to collect at that time. If I collected it a week or even 2 weeks later, it wouldn't have captured the learning or the effectiveness or the impact of the activity at that time. So once we collected it, I started putting it together and I realized there was a story there. And this turned out to be my first education publication. It was published in JMBE in the tips and tools section. Though this particular paper had feedback, it's not a requirement for the tips and tools section, as Mike will talk about later. So this is how I entered the space of education research. It was almost in some way, a little bit of learning through my previous professional experiences, but also by accident. I did this activity and I said, what can I do with it? It's worth sharing with the community. It can be replicated in other settings across the world. So this was the first. We can take the next slide, Mike. Thank you. But what this led to is an excitement for more. So while my research was picking up at the State University, I got hooked on to how I could use my teaching to advance my publication profile, and in some way even advance my research practice. So during my stint at the university, I had to teach several courses. Some of them were microbiology. And one of the things I noticed in stark contrast to what I had seen in the United States is that undergraduate curricula, microbiology curricula in India have almost no mention of biofilms. And my whole PhD and my independent research group was studying biofilms. And I found this a lacune in the curriculum. The curriculum did refer to microbial communities, but there was almost no specific mention of biofilms and their function, formation, processes, communication, and so on. I felt this was a gap that needed to be filled, and I shared the idea with a couple of young researchers in my team. They were excited about it too. And we said, what if we developed an educational module, like a pedagogical tool, which would allow educators to introduce biofilms, educators in India to introduce biofilms in the undergraduate curriculum and do it in an engaging, interesting manner. So we thought of how we would go about it. And a strategy we thought that would be effective was to use analogies. So this pedagogical tool is an analogy-based tool. As several of you would know, biofilms are superorganisms. They're these collective entities of microbes that have emergent properties, that is, properties that are larger than the sum of the individual components. And we thought that one superorganism that most undergraduates in India would be familiar with are beehives. They are also large collective entities of individuals with emergent collective properties, operating as a whole in some ways. And so we developed this pedagogical tool using an analogy between biofilms and beehives. And we did this across several important features of biofilms. For example, communication. A comparison between how biofilms communicate with chemical signals and how bees in the beehive communicate with chemical signals or pheromones. And so we fleshed out that part of the analogy. Then we spoke about how division of labor occurs in biofilms. It does. And the well-known example of division of labor in beehives. We also took other examples, such as emergent properties of both biofilms and beehives. So once we developed the module, and this was a thought exercise, this was like a writing and a reading exercise, we said the proof of the pudding is in being able to implement it, execute it, and collect feedback to see if it really worked. And so we took two groups of subjects. Again, importance of taking pre-approvals, ethical approvals, institutional review board, whatever is required at your institute before you do this. They were undergraduate students and they were school students, young students. And we executed the module for them. So it was like a voluntary sign-up, and we executed the module virtually on both occasions. And at the end of it, we collected feedback. And this was really detailed feedback. It also included pre-session feedback, which gauged their level of familiarity with both biofilms and beehives, and post-session feedback to parse out specific learning objectives after the module had been implemented. Lots of feedback was obtained, and we wrote it up. At that point, we published it as a preprint, because this was only my second education research work, and I didn't know where I would publish it. So I just put it out there as a preprint. And what happened was that a journal contacted me, and this happens to be a biofilm, the journal Biofilm, saying that we like this preprint and we would like to take it up for peer review in our journal. And we said, sure. And so we transferred it from a preprint to peer review, and it went through the peer review and was published in Biofilm. So my second example was actually a scientific journal contacting me to seek out the opportunity to publish our work. So that was very exciting as well. And this was a longer study. There was much more work involved than the science art module. Next slide, please, Mike. So I've left you with two examples, and this is the third one. So around COVID time, a colleague and I, she was in my research team, we started a science outreach program for young people in India, for children in India, called Talk to a Scientist India. And during COVID, we developed a hands-on activity for the students to do at home. So we all basically joined on Zoom, and we were doing this. And the hands-on activity related to the learning objective of conveying the message to school students that biofilms are more tolerant to antibiotics than free-floating planktonic bacteria. This is a well-known fact. The reasons for which are many. One of them is supposed reduced penetration of antibiotics to the biofilm. There are various other factors like efflux pumps being more active, micronutrient conditions, which make bacterial cells in a biofilm less responsive to antibiotics. But one of the factors was reduced penetration or reduced accessibility of the antibiotic to the bacteria in the biofilm. And so again, low resource, low cost is the way we went. What we really required them to do is take 2 plastic glasses, have sprinkles, like cake sprinkles that represent rods, bacterial rods, have some cake dye, colored dye to represent the antibiotic, and hair gel to represent the biofilm matrix. So we executed this entire thing virtually. And as you can see on the left, the free living bacteria are basically covered with the color, basically the cake coloring, which means the antibiotics have close access to the bacterial rods. Whereas in the biofilm, you can see a layer of hair gel or the extracellular matrix separating the rods, which are enmeshed in the matrix, and the colored antibiotic, in this case represented by a color. It was a very engaging activity. We could see the young people, working with their hands through the Zoom platform. And it was during COVID. We wanted to keep the resources easy to access. We didn't want people to go out shopping in the middle of a pandemic. And so all of this worked. At the end of this, we collected feedback again. And we published that as we found it. There were aspects of the module which we could have improved, and we published it in full honesty and authenticity. So again, this went and got published in JMBE as a tips and tools. And I believe, from what I've heard from colleagues across the world, this has been replicated in different settings across the world. And I thought that was an excellent idea, which was worth communicating to the wider educator/outreach community across the world. All right, next slide, please, Mike. Finally, we ran Talk to a Scientist India for about 5 years. It continues to be India's only science outreach platform virtually run for children, and a long-running platform, 5 years at that. We noticed during the course of running Talk to a Scientist that there are similar programs across the world, such as Type a Scientist in the United States, and there are a few programs in the UK and Europe as well. But we noticed that there were certain socio-cultural analogies, certain familiar terms, anecdotes, experiences that made a country-specific platform all the more relatable and exciting and engaging for the young people. So through our learnings across 5 years, including the challenges we faced and ways in which we improved the platform, we thought Talk to a Scientist India itself would be worth publishing for the outreach/educator community, with the idea of sharing our methods, experiences, challenges, learnings, so that committed educators across the world could build Talk to a Scientist in their own countries, like Talk to a Scientist Malaysia, Talk to a Scientist Philippines, Talk to a Scientist Peru, and so on. And so we pulled together our experience, feedback from 5 years. This was an extensive exercise, several weeks of writing this paper, and published it in JMBE. And that platform, and it's now out there with all our learnings for anyone to build a similar platform across the world. So this was my 4th education publication. As you can see, it started becoming a habit, and it became a very nice addition, detour from the research that I was doing and the research publications that were happening. And of course, for most of us, as you would see through Stan's talk as well, education and outreach is truly a passion. So it almost doesn't feel like work. All right, next slide, Mike. So what were some of my learnings? Like I said, I fell into the education research space by accident. Opportunities, I started, one opportunity worked out, and then I started looking for opportunities. I saw opportunities in almost everything I did related to teaching and education. So I think envisioning the outcome of the project, if this has to be published, what are things I need to start doing now? Because when it comes to ethical approvals and survey design, it's almost too late to do it as an afterthought, because you would have lost that cohort of participants, or the ethics wouldn't approve the survey as it stood, and so on. So it's a good idea to start thinking early. Also, and Stan pointed this out so well, like any research project, you should be able to state the goal or the specific outcome of the study. For example, it is a study to evaluate the effect of XYZ technique in microbiology education in this group of students and so on. So you should be able to state it very clearly, which will help with the study design and execution. Work backwards, as I mentioned, on statistics, metrics, how many students are you going to need? What kinds of students are they supposed to be? Undergraduate, school, high school, so on. Designing the feedback and surveys in advance, keeping the entire study in mind. And I think finally, my accidental journey to education research, which resulted in 4 publications, taught me, and I hope it tells you, that there are takers for quality education publications as long as these criteria are met. And JMBE will talk about the kind of work they are looking for when it comes to education publications. All right, so I think that's it, Mike. I'm done, but I'm open to taking questions anytime. And for those of you who are living and working in India, if you have specific questions about doing this kind of work in India, I'm available on email. So once again, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Stan. And we'll take questions.
Thank you indeed, Karishma. And Stanley, you both shared some very valuable information about your journeys and experiences in education research and how it fits so organically into an academic career, how it's a natural extension of teaching and research in academia. I wonder, could we see the results of the first poll, thinking of careers? Okay, so that's a nice split there. Basically, a third teacher educator, a little under a quarter's researcher, a little more faculty. So again, very different ways you can get into education research. And many people haven't. About a quarter have published in education research, but many haven't. So again, great to see such interest across many parts of one's career and many levels of experience in education research. And so with that, I'd like to continue this train of thought into how can you publish education projects once you've started them, once you've finished them, and share them with the broader community by talking about the publication landscape generally for both science and education, because whatever your background, whatever your field, you work very hard cultivating your ideas, planning and conducting research, writing up results. And so, of course, you want to document it, share it with your colleagues here and around the world to advance the science and advance education. So let's explore the publication marketplace in the modern era. Worldwide, the number of science and engineering articles published per year has gone from under 1 million in 1996 to more than 3 million at the beginning of this decade. Specifically, per Web of Science, there were more than 70,000 new microbiology articles published and more than 40,000 education research articles published just last year. Compare that to the year 2020, when only half that number of education papers were published. Not only that, the number of education research journals indexed in Web of Science is now more than 700, 3 times what it was just 5 years ago. So the digital age has made it that much easier to share your thoughts across the world and made professional publication more accessible. But that also means that the market has gotten that much more crowded. So what we want, or what you want, and what we also want for you, is for your research to stand out, to have a platform, to find its audience after it's published and well after it's published. You want to think about things like the reputation of the publisher and the journal, what the peer review process is like, and accessibility, visibility, and persistence of your article. So where to publish? Reading the journals in your field is the best place to start. Where your paper is a good fit. Does the journal publish the kind of manuscript you wrote? Does it have similar works that your paper is building upon, and would it fit well with those articles from a reader's perspective? Working backwards, look at the references list in your own paper. If many articles are from the same source, then that may be a good journal to consider. This also gets to the question of reputation. Is the journal well esteemed by you, by your colleagues, by the field? Is it published by a reputable publisher with whom you can feel comfortable trusting your work, not just during the peer review process and publication, but for visibility in the long term? And from there, what are the attributes of the journal that you want? Ultimately, we believe that a thorough and constructive peer review process is very important to refining your work. So that should be a consideration. But do you want a journal that has, for example, an open peer review where reviews are published and reviewer identities may be revealed, or does that not matter so much? Do you want the article to be open access, freely available with a Creative Commons license, or is subscription access fine? Information like this can generally be found on any given journal's website. The important thing is aligning your priorities with the right publication for you. In exploring journals and publishers, I of course invite you to consider ASM journals. Our editorial vision is that ASM Journals will be the home for all research that advances in microbial sciences. And you can get a sense from that array of diverse journals at the bottom of the slide. Altogether, publishing impactful science from around the globe with expert editors and constructive peer review in support of you, the researchers and educators. You notice on the right of the graphic is JMBE, the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education, which we have discussed earlier. JMBE is ASM's open access journal that publishes curriculum resources and tips and tools for teaching biology in any kind of classroom and even outside the classroom. It publishes education research articles, as we've discussed today, measuring the outcomes of learning interventions and programs, as well as perspective articles about the challenges in the educational system and ways we can address them. I should stress that JMBE is the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education, so not just microbiology, but we are really STEM-oriented. Interdisciplinarity is so important. So biochemistry, for instance, would be an option. So we have a broad view about education research, and we want your insights and resources as educators. I want to share a graphic illustrating JMBE's 4 core article types, which our speakers have also discussed in their talks. Perspectives, as I just described on the far left, and these represent a thoughtful discussion of ongoing issues that educators face, problems and possible solutions. Tips and tools, as Karishma described, is about putting those ideas into practice. So you might have an idea or a method you've tried out, you don't have much data, maybe anecdotal reports that it seems to work, and that would be a tips and tools paper. Next, here's where discipline-based education research comes in, or DBER comes in. If you designed an education research study, as Stanley said and laid out, tested your hypothesis that the intervention works, and you write that up with methods and results, that is a research paper. And finally, if you have all that data and your activity is proven effective and you can provide detailed instructions and resources so that educators can go out and use it, you can submit that as a curriculum paper. These are all important types of resources, and you can see the progression along from left to right, how any educational concept might fit somewhere in one of those types. I wanted to share a few examples of each. You can see again from left to right a perspective paper considering learning objectives for virology curriculum guidelines, a tips and tools paper on the use of TikTok for science communication, a research paper assessing undergraduates' experiences and preferences for online versus in-person courses, and finally a curriculum paper with a full activity using a short film with detailed resources and learning gains. Altogether, a wide range of article types for you to read or publish, whatever your interest, and wherever you are in your educational career. And with that, I wonder, could we load the next poll question, please? Do you have educational modules or research that you think could be published as an education paper currently? I'll wait a moment. You can fill that out. And I guess, can we see the results? Okay, so 62%, so more than half. So yeah, so that's good, and hopefully we can see some of those papers published in the near future. And I'll also mention that JMBE has annual special series for which we launch calls for papers on a given theme with a dedicated set of editors to the topic. This year's is practical and positive uses of AI in STEM education, artificial intelligence, very topical right now. It's on everybody's minds, certainly those of us in education. So we want to know what research, what ideas, what resources you're using to incorporate AI into your teaching. You can find more information with the QR code on the screen, but we've also had other special series which we've listed here, the most recent being on professional development and also on scientific literacy. You can find all of these under the theme issues link on the JMBE site. I should stress that all of these topics are still important to JMBE, and we welcome work addressing any of them. And with that, I'd like to thank you all again. I invite you to complete our final poll question. And with that, we can move to the Q&A.
So I think that the first question is, I developed a cure for microbiology that's ungraded, and think it was effective, but I don't have quantitative data to back it up. Is there an output for that, or do we need data to be able to publish with you? So I have two answers to this. One of the answers is all data does not have to be quantitative. There are ways of doing analysis of qualitative data that can be very compelling. And so your data may fit into something where the qualitative data is strong enough that you could go into a research type of article. If not, I would suggest that you consider publishing in tips and tools. As Michael just said, tips and tools is really meant to, you want to provide any evidence that you have of its effectiveness, but it's really meant to stimulate other people to think about this new way of providing educational resources. So.
There is another question for you, Stanley, if you want to take that one or.
I see down here another question that says, I've been running the microbiology course for PhD students for the past 10 years, and I'd really like to share this whole course with the community that teaches microscopy, right? Including quizzes, assessments, all of the tools. I have a hard time finding which journal I should send the paper to describing the course and how teachers can use it, right? So if you have evidence for how this works, it could fit very well as a curriculum article in JMBE. If you basically have a course description and you haven't accumulated that kind of evidence, there's some other places that might be good. One of the places that will just take course content is called Course Source. It's not an ASM journal, but it allows you to post, to get a publication for the description of a course, the basic description of a course that others can use. The difficulty is if you publish in JMBE, that will get picked up by Google Scholar. So people can easily find your work. If you publish in Course Source, it becomes a little bit harder to find. And so, so that's one of the things you want to keep in mind.
That's good, Stan. And I would just add to that point, if it's okay, on the microscopy course. If you've been running it for 10 years, I would think that there would be a lot of feedback that you can analyze, which would buttress, which would really support your article when it goes as a curriculum paper. All right. I think there's a question that was assigned to me. Do we need approval from the Institutional Review Board when you're using students' learning data? So I'm assuming you mean students you are teaching as part of your course in the institution. Our institute doesn't have an IRB. So this is a challenge in some institutions in India. My answer would be, yes, you will need it. Even if it is your own students who are taking the course as part of their mandatory curriculum or credits, you will still need it to publish. So what would you do if your institute doesn't have an IRB? There are research organizations that at a small fee do provide IRB services. And you can I don't need to name them here, but you could just email me and I'll be happy to share them with you. And they are in India and you can get it done through them. But you will likely need it to publish. Stan and Mike, you can correct me if JMB has any other guidelines.
No, I think that was really very good advice. If you are in a different part of the world and you're not sure what to do, I think that if you connect with us at JMBE, we can help connect you with a potential somebody who can help answer that question at the local level, because these decisions, they have to meet international approval, but the decisions are really made at the local level.
Yes, exactly. So there's another question for me, Stan, question 4. Thank you for the webinar. And this person has completed their PhD in India and is currently in Germany and would like to pursue a research career. And how could they identify research opportunities and building connections with the academic and research community? Well, I would have loved to say Twitter, X, in another time, in another era. But I still think Twitter has its value, especially if you've done your PhD in India, you want to build connections in Germany, and you want to retain your connections in India. I would say X is a good place to get started. There are other platforms like LinkedIn and others, but I do know that X is quite popular amongst scientists in India. And I've connected with people across the world through that platform. So all its limitations and challenges aside, I would recommend that. Stanley, anything else? How would you do this?
I would just add that don't just do one thing. I think X can be useful for this, but I would also add it to LinkedIn, right? The more eyes that can get on your accomplishments and abilities, the more likely you are to find the position that's right for you, right? So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Stan, there's a question for both of us, which you can take first. What do you recommend for building surveys? Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
You take this one.
Tough one. So the first survey I built was with a faculty in the psychology department, humanities department. They helped me structure it. Post that, I sort of have done it on my own because I've used the first set of surveys as a template. But it's a good idea to get someone who does surveys regularly. And otherwise, at least get it reviewed by a few people before you finalize that survey. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, I'll just follow up and say, I think the idea of connecting with people, if you have a psychology departments often have people who do a lot of surveys. So that was really great advice to make that connection.
That's great, Stan.
It fits very much with our comment about statisticians. If you get stuck, find somebody on campus who can help you.
Exactly. I think that's the beauty of working out of a campus, an academic campus. You'll always find someone, Great. Sam, there's another question about ethics approvals, which have been posted for you. Maybe you can take that.
Yes. So the question is related to getting ethics approval for live collection of data. And how do you get approval from students while they're doing the activity? You really you can't do it while they're doing the activity. It's not the right time. This has to do with the planning. Plan in advance, get the students' approval in advance, and get confirmation afterwards. It's a very good practice for if you're going to go forward with this kind of data. Approvals are really important. I have to say, though, that you may talk to your human subjects committee, your institutional resource, and they may tell you that, in fact, you don't need approval for this particular type of experiments. There's some kinds of education experiments that don't need approval. And so if that's true, right, and don't do this without the approval, but if they say you don't need that approval, then you're free to accumulate data as fits the approved process. So the next question comes back to you, Karishma. Question number 7.
Which is related to doing a small study in a classroom, which was similar to some of the case examples that I gave. And how could I make it useful not only for students, but teachers, researchers, so that journals will publish it? So I think some of the tips in the webinar would help, like sort of being able to state the study in the few lines, like what exactly are you aiming to do from here on? Really writing out the study before you even implement it, and then implementing it in your small classroom and collecting feedback data with a well-designed survey. I think this will be a good step to get JMBE to publish it, though you don't need feedback necessarily or survey data to publish it in tips and tools. But even for you to know that it is working, that kind of information would be valuable. So you end the question with saying, I'm facing issues in designing and conducting it. So designing it is something before conducting it. And I would use some of the suggestions given in this webinar. And while conducting it, taking notes and collecting feedback.
So the next question relates to types of reviews, right? So JMBE has a section called perspectives. One of the key things it wants is it doesn't want you to just present a variety of information that exists in the literature. It wants you to put in context. It wants you to to take your personal experience and provide that so that other people can understand it and build on it. I have to say, with the advent of widespread use of AI, we are getting lots and lots of submissions of systematic reviews. Many of those were clearly written by AI. A lot of those are really very flimsy articles. So I guess in answering this question, the difference between different types of reviews, what you call them, is probably not as important as the value added that they provide, the insights, the perspectives, the way you can take data that could be confusing in a grand scale and turn it into something that will lead other people to understand what's been done and to think about what the next questions would be. That is the real value of a review. And that's also a core concept of the perspective section of JMBE, right? With the advent of AI and the use of these tools, I think we really need someone to come through and do a careful analysis of the definition between each of these types of endeavors. So,
Stanley, there's another question for you too.
Oh.
Question 9 for us in the.
So this question requires to Bronwell's data that looks at retention and time of the lecture. And the question is, do you think it has to do with the time of day when it was delivered and other things? I think that the general, yes, it can happen. You get students right after lunch when they're sleepy. And the basic thing that Bronwell showed is that if you're really an engaging instructor, usually you can grab their attention at the beginning. But in fact, it falls off pretty quickly. And it may fall off a little more quickly in one situation than another, but the basic shape of those curves is really consistent across a lot of populations, different teaching situations, and different age groups. And so that was the thing that really struck me, was that this isn't answering an anecdotal question. This is really providing a broad piece of information about how we can teach better. Right?
And I think question 10 is for me, Stan. I know you and I both have, we are a little biased towards JMBE, but we'll take this question nevertheless. Are there any journals similar to JMBE for best mentorship, to publish best mentorship practices? For example, if someone does a study where they look at PI strategies, philosophies, and compare trainee outcomes. So definitely JMBE would be a good place for it, especially if you've worked with the biology, microbiology community. Other journal is, I would say, Frontiers has an education journal. Sage has a journal of education. I hope it's okay, Mike, that I'm mentioning these names. And other than that, I would say, honestly, PNAS has published articles like this as well, related to, for example, PhD student health and outcomes related to their training and mentorship experiences. So if it's a really well-developed study, even PNAS could be a taker. And PLOS Biology has a section that also that publishes education articles. So it's really about how well the study is done. And from what I have realized is, when a scientific journal approached me to publish an education work that was a preprint, I realized, sometimes we self-reject. We just don't think it's going to get there. But if it's a really good study, it can even go into some of these really well-known journals.
And I think that does get back to the point about finding sort of comparable examples in the literature. So whether JMBE, CBE, whatever journal, if you see that there are good examples of papers on mentorship that you've enjoyed, that you've incorporated or integrated into your work, that you feel like your paper would be a good fit among those, that would be a good journal to consider too.
That's right. That's true. Yeah.
So I think that I would just like to come back and respond to the question about reviews. Um, I, I'm not aware of a recent article that puts each of these into context with some examples that would make it easy to understand. And so I think that that's something that would be of value. And I think we can work on putting something like that together, although it's not going to be out tomorrow, but we'll work on writing a piece for that and putting it in a prominent place so that it will make it a lot easier to understand what we're looking for and why we're looking for those particular things.
And the other complication is just generally you have meta-analyses, systematic reviews, scope, and they all can kind of interact. You can have one that's more than one of those labels. So it is very interesting. You can there are resources out there, but not everyone sort of defines them the same. So just highlighting the issue, but it's good to be interested in these things because there's a lot of data that does need that sort of assessment.
We had a couple of other questions that I'd like to deal with. And one of them is, there are some people here who would like to get into doing education research, but don't even know where to start. And so they would like some useful resources. Last summer, an education research society called SABRE and the American Society for Microbiology ran an online course that really went through all of the aspects of TBER education, a very valuable, thorough course. It wasn't just something presented. There were instructors who provided advice and spoke to particular topics as you went along. That is not freely available right now, but I think that based on the questions that we have here, we need to make something like that available. And so that's something that we can work on and try to provide as a resource. And if we can come up with the right resource, we'll write a short editorial for JMBE that will make people aware of where they can gain access to that resource. So that's something. The wonderful thing about questions, and all of us know who've stood in front of a classroom of students, is sometimes you need to answer, I don't know, but I will find out, right? And so in this case, I don't have it set right now, but we'll work on it. And that ties also to some of the questions. So one of them is, will a survey involving 100 students be good for tips and students? What quantity do you need? Well, there really isn't a magic number. You might have something that's got 30 students from a classroom and still provides really valuable information. So it isn't just a numbers game. It's about the information that you can derive from those numbers, right? Oh, and then another question that was brought up is that some students are saying, we get too many surveys. We just ignore them because we're just deluged in surveys. This is something I think all of us feel, even if you're not a student in the classroom. And so I think what it means is that you have to use a little psychology in terms of how you do them. So for example, instead of expecting them to do that after they leave class, providing some time in class for them to do it, where you have something planned right afterwards. So they can't just finish it and leave the room or pretend to finish it and leave the room. But embedding it in the class is one way that you can get more attention to surveys. But there are other things you can do. You can provide some kind of intrinsic reward for people who fill out the surveys. And it doesn't have to be a lot, because human nature appreciates rewards of any size, right? And so I think that there are ways we can entice our students to provide the information we need to think about doing our jobs better. Those are a couple of tricks. But the other thing is just letting them know how important that survey is to you. And it also engages students more effectively. Karishma, do you have any other tricks?
I mean, absolutely. I would say one of them is making it do it in the class and giving them time for that so that it's not an afterthought when they have so much else to handle out of the classroom. I think the other thing is also being upfront and saying, we would like to use this data to publish this as an educational module, and you will be contributing to something that could be used by students across the world. It does get them excited to think of themselves as part of a larger initiative. That could be the other thing. And I think we have one we can wrap up very soon, but we have one good question, which I forgot to allude to in my talk, is that about waivers. Does JMBE have publication fee waivers for LMIC submissions? And yes, thank you for bringing that up, Tazeen. It does. And it's a very fair system. For the articles published in JMBE, I have received full publication waivers. There is a form, and it's based on certain criteria, like are you working at an institution that serves underrepresented minorities in science? Are you working in an LMIC country? Are you a faculty under 5 years of your position, of starting your position, and so on? So there are some criteria. You fill it up and they let you know whether you've received it. But for publications that I have published, and this was before I was an editor in the tips and tools section, just to clarify that, I have received publication waivers.
And I would like to just add one more thing based upon a couple of the comments. So JMBE specifically publishes education research. So if you're working on diabetes, or if you're working on one of these other areas, and it's not about education. I mean, you might be working on educating people who have diabetes, and that could fit into a different category. But if you're doing basic research in another area, JMBE is not the right place for that research. As Michael mentioned, there are many other ASM journals that deal with a wide swath of science. But I think finding the place where articles like what you want to publish are published is a really good way to get started in this process.
And with that, I believe we're at time. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again, to Stanley, to Karishma, and thank you all for attending this session, which has had a wealth of information and expertise from our speakers. Thank you all in attendance for your enthusiasm in education and education research, and wishing you all a wonderful day.